Welcome to Election Watch. I'm Rohit Kumar. It is Wednesday, September 4th, and we are 61 days out from the U.S. presidential election on November 5th. Questions about the eventual result continue to come in, and today we're going to focus on regulations. What exactly happens to the regulatory process in an election year? And what is the fate of guidance written under one administration if an election puts another administration in charge? We'll walk through these questions and talk about specific guidance, including CAMT, DCL, and more, with Pat Brown and Pam Olson. Pat, Pam, welcome.
Good to be here, Rohit.
Pam, I'm going to come to you first. So what are some of the issues that come up for the agencies as we approach an election, and especially if there's a change in administration? Is there any sort of pause in the regulatory process?
Well, there can be a pause in the regulatory process because the administration generally wants the president to stay the focus of the election discussion that's going on. In this case, of course, it would be Vice President Harris, that the administration would want to stay the focus on whatever it is that she's saying, what she's commenting on. And you don't want that to be upset by something that comes out of one of the agencies unexpectedly. So there can be kind of a slowdown in the process. Then once we get to the election, it's generally full steam ahead. In particular, if there's a change in administration, then the outgoing administration will want to try to get as much done as possible that's on its agenda that it hasn't yet accomplished. Obviously, there are a lot of things that have been on this administration's agenda in terms of finalizing or proposing, in some cases, regulations to carry out some of the legislation that was enacted during this administration. And I'm sure, particularly with respect to some items like CAMT, they're hoping to get that guidance out before the end of the year.
Pat, what about on the sort of international side of the ledger?
Yeah, so it's funny, Rohit, you talked about a pause in the regulatory process. Of course, the rest of the world does not pause because the United States is having a presidential election or congressional election. So things like Pillar 2, obviously work is continuing through the inclusive framework on Pillar 2, and regulatory guidance, for example, the recently proposed dual consolidated loss regs contain within them guidance that is directly applicable and directly relevant to Pillar 2. So I think in the international area, Treasury has to continue to stay engaged, and we expect them to. But to be sure, there may very well be a shift in emphasis or shift in focus if there's a change in party in the White House as a result of the November election. So it's a process that has to continue because the rest of the world is not going to pause. But everybody recognizes that there's a big event coming up in November that could influence the trajectory of the United States policy position going forward. So that's one of the things, not just within this country, but around the world, folks will be watching.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because the international stuff has become a little more partisan, maybe in its orientation. So if there's a change in control, you might expect a change in approach, especially on some of the international issues. Pam, if Vice President Harris wins, and so you have continuing Democratic control of the White House and the Treasury Department, what changes, if any, happen, at Treasury and sort of the administration generally?
Given the fact that Vice President Harris seems to pretty much align with the proposals that have been the foundation of the Biden administration approach, it seems like there will probably mostly be a continuation of what's gone on over the course of the last 4 years on the regulatory front. So I'm not expecting there to be a whole lot of change. Now, the first thing that might change would be at the level of personnel. It's been customary for presidential appointees to tender their resignation at the end of an administration, even if it's a re-election of a president, and then the president has a choice whether to accept or reject the resignation. Certainly, there are some people who joined the Biden administration kind of late in the administration who anticipated staying on should President Biden have been reelected. They probably hope to stay on if Vice President Harris is elected. And there's an old saying in Washington, your people are your policy. So a lot gets determined by policy. So if we have a Harris administration and the people kind of stay in place, then I would expect that we would see a continuation of the policy, perhaps with some bit of a refresh, just given the fact that there's a new president and the new president may have some changes in focus.
Now, let's play out the other hypothetical. So let's say Trump wins. Clearly significant sort of change at the political levels of the Treasury Department. What should people be looking for if that were the result that we find ourselves with?
Your people are your policy. And so the first thing we'll be looking at is who comes into the administration to take the top roles. At the IRS, there are two political roles. One is the commissioner and one is the chief counsel. The commissioner has a 5-year term, and so it's not likely that Danny Werfel, the current commissioner of the IRS, is going to be going anywhere until his 5-year term expires. The chief counsel is a different story. The chief counsel would, in all likelihood, tender resignation and then leave. Now, at the beginning of the Biden administration, the chief counsel, who had been appointed fairly late in the Trump administration, did offer to stay on for some continuity. And it's possible that the chief counsel will do that again, but it seems more likely that the chief counsel will be replaced. Same in the Office of Tax Policy, one political appointee, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Tax Policy, that is currently occupied on an acting basis. There isn't a nominated and confirmed person in that role, so we would expect to see that change over as well, and that's going to change policy there.
Okay, Pat, let's do a little bit of a forward look. So what should companies be doing as they await some of the guidance that we mentioned at the beginning of the episode?
Yeah, so we talked about KMT. PTEP is another reg package that people are waiting for. I would say that neither one of these reg packages, both of which are significant, both of which we've been waiting for quite a while, neither one of these reg packages is sort of overtly political. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, companies should do what we would expect companies to do anytime regulations are issued, in this case, proposed regulations. There's a notice and comment period. Review the regulations, provide comments. So it's very much kind of, business as usual from that perspective. Again, this is guidance that we've been expecting for a while and issues that need to be addressed. I mean, this is where the rulemaking process, separate and apart from anything going on presidential politics, needs to move forward. There are issues that need to be addressed, answers that taxpayers need. And so review that guidance when it comes out, hopefully soon, and provide comments to the government about the direction that was taken, things that weren't addressed, things that could be addressed differently. So in some sense, that's pretty straightforward. There are other regulations that have been released fairly recently where there's maybe more of a political undertone to some of them, in the sense that when I talk about the dual consolidated loss regs, the stock buyback excise tax regs, the foreign tax credit regulations, which are actually released in final form in 2022, but have since been dialed back, these are all sort of open items on the Treasury Department's agenda right now. In the case of DCL and the excise tax regs, proposed regs are out, comments are coming in the case of DCL, or have come in the case of the excise tax regs. But what policy direction is the government going to take going forward? And could that be affected by the outcome of the presidential election? Again, in the case of both those regulations, the Treasury Department took a pretty assertive approach. The question is, will that same approach be taken if the administration changes and we have a President Trump instead of a President Harris come January? I think with respect to the FTC regs, even though they were issued in final form, because they were dialed back, the question is, and what direction forward will the Treasury Department take, and will that be influenced by the presidential election outcome? And of course, underlying all of this, to go back to where we started, Rohit, Pillar 2. Both the DCL rules and the FTC regulations clearly implicate some of the issues that are a part of the Pillar 2 process. And so the administration's posture towards Pillar 2 could very well influence how they choose to finalize the DCL rules and the path forward that they choose to take on the FTC regulations. So a lot to think about on those packages as we look towards November and beyond.
All right. I think we're going to have to end it there with my favorite forward look on Pillar 2, everyone's favorite tax topic of the day. Pam, Pat, thanks for joining. As I mentioned at the top of the show, we are 61 days from this year's election. And in those 61 days, we will cover a lot of ground here on Policy on Demand through Tax Insights and on PwC's Tax Readiness webcasts. The latest insight, comparing the Harris and Trump approaches to U.S. tax policy, is linked in the description of this episode. Until next time, take care.